I named, as well as like Benjamin Franklin and a number of others as well. So, who are some of these people that were the rogues that people might be surprised that you had listed as the rogues in that sense?
Which you said before that you're doing this from North Carolina. North
Yeah.
Carolina plays a huge role in this book. It's the first colony to give its delegates permission to vote yes on independence. They're not allowed to bring up the issue of independence, but North Carolina is the first one to give approval for independence. And the reason for that is because there's been all this turmoil in North Carolina in the 1770s, and one of the worst guys in the book is North Carolina Governor William Tryon, who in 1771 leads this attack on Western North Carolina farmers, not too far from Durham, North Carolina, at Alamance, and there is this enormous civil unrest happening in North Carolina, and what those farmers want is better government. So they are feeling like the officials are corrupt. They are there's not enough of them, and we want more government. And the British Empire, through this guy Tryon, doesn't want to give it to them, and so that breaks down into violence. Tryon is going to leave and go become the governor of New York, New York colony, where it's going to make things worse. But he's one of the guys who is very much on the America. And North Carolina comes up repeatedly in the Declaration of Independence as one of the sites. It's not just Boston and Philadelphia.
Yeah, not only that, but there is an active, my cousins, and actually they just recently lost their mom and everything like that, is a part of the Native American culture. I mean, I identify primarily in the African American side of my heritage, but I do acknowledge other parts of my heritage as well. But some of my cousins only claim the Native side and everything like that. But I do know that the Natives were very important, even in the sense of what was going on in independence. So does the book touch on that at all? Because of course there's the lost colonies that is here in North Carolina, and some people are now saying that they may know what happened to the lost colony and everything like that. But
Right.
is this explored as well in the book?
Well, the last grievance of the Declaration talks about the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. It's one of the most impassioned parts of a very passionate document. And the reason that is the last grievance, and it's coupled up, by the way, with the king has incited enslaved people and indigenous peoples to fight against the revolution. And the reason that is the last grievance is because it is the ultimate deal breaker. That has been one of the most important news stories of 1775 and 1776. And the Patriot leaders have been promoting that story and trying to make Americans afraid and aware that that's happening all over the place. And so, yes, that's a critical factor. And it's entirely unfair to indigenous peoples who have been nothing but merciful for the first year of the Revolutionary War. But that's there because the idea of kind of race and fear is right at the heart of the Declaration.
Well, speaking of race and fear, one of the things that is oftentimes talked about with the Declaration of Independence is very much an important phrase, and you actually even mention it in the book, but some people say that it was never really addressed in the way that it should have been, because there is the whole phrase of we know that all men are created equal, and the whole notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and everything like that. And of course, there's certain inalienable rights and everything like that, but African Americans didn't actually get the right to vote and a number of other things till much later. And I think women even came along much later as well, even though the phrase does say "all men," it doesn't even mention women and everything along those lines. So, in your research, what have you found about the notion of whether they were even going to include slaves? Because, of course, there's the notion of 3/5 of a man and all along those lines, and of
Right.
course the role of women as well, because a lot of that didn't develop till much later in our American history.
Well, the sentences, those phrases that you know from the Declaration that you can just roll off of the top of your head. And I think most Americans would say that that encompasses the whole Declaration, and they might not even know that there are more than 24 grievances listed, very specific things in the Declaration. Those words are almost entirely Jefferson. That Jefferson wrote those words in the rough draft. And Congress approved them with only the slightest little edits here and there, and so they thought that was good, but they spent most of their time working on the grievances, about editing them and getting them right. So they approved of those things, and in fact, when when a copy of the Declaration goes to England, a political writer is put in charge of writing this 132-page pamphlet that's refuting the Declaration. And 119 of those 132 pages are about the grievances. And on page 119, he says, of the preamble, where those words appear, I take no notice and little does it deserve. He kind of just waves it away. So in 1776, some of those ideas, those Enlightenment ideas about where human beings get their rights from and this sort of self-evident truths, that's all kind of in the air. And people, you're right, people aren't really defining exactly who that is. And who's in and who's out. I think the revolution's sort of course will help determine that. But they're just kind of saying, yeah, that makes sense. That's not our main energy to be focused on here today.
Now, before I bring in Rick Rosler, who's one of our regular panelists, as well as Dr. Sharif, who is coming in from Bangladesh, and of course they've had their own independence conversations and all along those lines. I know that Nick's in the background, so he actually just brought him in for us and everything along those lines. What are some of the grievances that people don't know? Because, like I said, you've written this book. It just actually got published, I believe, yesterday was the first official day of its release and everything like that. And it's called Tyrants and Rogues, and it offers this new account of the American Revolution and shows that the issues that most alarmed colonists in 1776 are even relevant in 2026 and everything like that. So what are the ways that it is relevant, and what are some of the other grievances? We even hear people talk about, and I know maybe Nick will jump in later, these no kings marches where people are afraid that we're going back to a monarchy with some of the current leadership.
That's right. I mean, so the grievances, you know, one of the reasons I think it's been more than 100 years since anybody wrote a book about what they all mean, partly because that could be a kind of a boring way to do it, and that's what I didn't want to do. That's why I featured the rogues and the kind of the narrative stories and the biographies of some of these guys as a way to kind of get away from this kind of the dry analysis of what each specific one meant. But the way they spoke to me in 2026 is these are a lot of things that we are very concerned about today. You see in the grievances, if you take a step back from 1776 and put them in our language, what we're talking about here, they're talking about what we would call executive orders and executive overreach. They're talking about how you get justice in the empire, who judges are beholden to, how partial judges could actually be. They're talking about the civilian control of the military. And they're talking about how are public officials beholden to the people that they represent. All of those issues are things we're talking about probably on this channel and everywhere all the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything like that. Like I said, Rick's got a question for you as well. The book is called Tyrants and Rogues, and this is Robert Parkinson that has written the book. And I think that you're in West Virginia, if I remember correctly, and everything.
That's right.
Like that. But definitely, who are some of the tyrants that people may not know? You mentioned one of them, but name some of the other tyrants and rogues. And then, like I said, Rick's got a question for you as well.
Sure. I mean, my favorite one is the one that brought out the most anger in people, which was Lord Hillsborough. Lord Hillsborough was the Secretary of State for the American colonies, and there's a lot of thinking about land in the Declaration. Who are the rightful, going back to what we talked about with indigenous peoples, who's the empire for? And what you're seeing in the generation of when George Washington grows up. So George Washington's born in 1732. As he is a teenager and in his 20s, there is tremendous amounts of immigration coming to America, either by choice from Europe or the British Isles, or not by choice from the continent of Africa. But there's so many new people here that the borders of the colonies are expanding, and Lord Hillsborough owns 100,000 acres of Ireland in County Down, Ireland. And he doesn't want to watch his Irish tenants going to America and getting cheap land and setting up for themselves. He gives this kind of sassy speech in Parliament where he says, can you believe these turkeys are going to America and like getting free land or cheap land and like setting up for themselves? That's not fair. And then they're writing back to their friends and he's watching all of his tenants leave, and he wants to put a stop to that. And so there's a lot of efforts to try to shut off the supply of immigrants to America, and the columnists say that's entirely unfair.
Yeah.
Well, so a couple things. One is George III. he gets a lot of blame. And but my wife watches Bridgerton, which shows a completely different George III, who's kind of a shy, nice guy interested in science. So, how big a jerk was George III? And also, who were the jerks on the side of independence? Not everybody who was pro independence could have been a totally nice guy.
Oh, for sure. So the first question is George is beloved. George. So what happens in the early 18th century? Because Britain is so concerned that this is about religion and politics, really. So they're so concerned about keeping a Protestant king on the throne and not having it be a Catholic king, and staying away from absolutist monarchy, that they are willing to find anybody to serve on the throne who fits those two descriptions. And so they find George the First. Is from Hanover, Germany. He speaks not a lick of English when he becomes the King of England. And then his son becomes George II, all throughout the 18th century. And neither of those guys are Englishmen, and even George II has a really hard time even speaking English in London. But when George III comes to the throne in 1760, he's in his early 20s. He's very hale. He is seen as this kind of this new breath of fresh air. He's known as Farmer George because he's really interested in agriculture, and he's beloved. It also helps that Great Britain is kind of at the peak of their powers emerging then. But yeah, he's and so that's and so when you read the Declaration, it is this. It's this very sassy and upset breakup letter. It's a very emotional breakup letter because they love George and they can't believe he's allowing these guys to do these things to us. Now, who are the jerks in America? Well, it depends on how we define who a jerk is. I think Sam Adams is a little bit hard to live with because he has a specific way of thinking about how the world should go. He has this kind of utopian dreamer's idea about how liberty should be. And if you don't agree with him, he's going to figure out a way to undermine you and make sure. So Sam Adams is a brilliant politician, but he is a radical in a way that I think made it hard to be around him.
Hey, just really quickly, along those same lines and everything, because you kind of alluded to it in one of your answers and everything like that. One of the things that they talk about a lot in America is this notion of us being a Judeo-Christian nation and everything like that. But I don't know necessarily that that's what the founders had in mind and everything like that. So what did you find in your research and things along those lines? Because that is even the conversation we're seeing with even some of the MAGAs and other things like that. This
Right.
notion of us being a Judeo-Christian nation, even though we know that there are a number of other religions. I mean, I know that even though he's in Bangladesh, Dr. Sharif is of the Muslim faith and everything along those lines. But there are a number of other religions that exist and everything like that. But we are seen as this Christian nation and everything. And I think that that's the way that the narrative is put out there.
Right. Well, the Declaration does not endorse a Protestant Christian God, right? In the preamble, it talks about nature's God and it talks about a creator. And one of the reasons that it does that is because it's trying to reach for as many possible people as they can. The Declaration is a mission statement of the revolution, but it is seeking an audience, and they are trying to convince enough American people, because what starts the whole process of independence is that they see an invasion fleet crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and there are on board those ships are thousands of British redcoats and 10,000 German mercenaries who've been hired assassins to kill Americans. And so they have to get as many people possibly on board with this project as they can right now. I mean, on the 4th of July, after they approve the Declaration, they send out these desperate, panicked messages to Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware. Get your guys to New York City as fast as you can, because we're under attack, guys, any minute now. And so that's why they can't be specific about picking nits about which kind of Protestantism or excluding Catholics or Jews. So it's trying to get its arms around everybody.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything like that. Now, one of the other things that a lot of the history talks about, and I know that even Nick has joined us, he's one of the founders of the network, and he has some royalty of his own descendancy and everything like that. So I know he'll have a question for you after I get to the question that I've got and everything. But the other thing that is oftentimes talked about in American history is this notion Because we used to have a gentleman that used to come on regularly from Australia, and a lot of times when we think of Australia and we think of the United States, a lot of these people that were coming over were literally the criminals of the society. They were criminals from London and other things like that because they were going against either religious rules or they were in some cases going against actual crimes and everything like that, what we would consider more like jailable offenses now and everything like that. So it's wondering
Right.
the book touches on that at all, because a lot of these people that were coming over from London weren't in other parts of Europe, whether it was Spain or some of the other countries that were doing some of the colonizing and everything like that. They weren't exactly the most nicest people in the world.
Well, I mean, that's not something that I touched on in the book because that's not exactly in the Declaration, but it's true that Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia were the three places. They were the first Australia where transportation out of London and English jails, they would be sent to America. The Daniel Defoe book from the early 18th century, Moll Flanders. Moll is she's a prostitute who's arrested in London and she's sent to Virginia in the 1720s. That's happening all the time, but that's what gets disrupted in 1776. England can't send those guys here anymore, so they look for that starts a 15-year search to find where can we send our criminals again? And the end result of that, of course, is Botany Bay, Australia. So this is part of the kind of world, and there's some books coming out this year that are really much looking at the world and global effects of the revolution, but that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Rick, you had a question, and I know Nick.
Yeah, so the founding fathers kind of punted on slavery. Was there any chance that they would have done a better job from a modern point of view of dealing with and eradicating, or at least designing, did they screw it up or did they have no choice?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in the Declaration, there is a 168-word denunciation of the transatlantic slave trade. That's 10% of the whole document itself that Jefferson writes, and it is extremely emotional and passionate denunciation where he calls the transatlantic slave trade cruel war against human nature, an assemblage of horrors, piratical warfare, and the war against human beings themselves. And Congress cuts almost all of it out because Southerners don't like that. But also Jefferson writes later on in his life about what happened to that. He says the Northerners also were very upset about that because he talks about the transatlantic slave trade. Well, where are those slave ships being built? They're being built in Massachusetts, and those crews are coming from Rhode Island. And so what that does is when that all that goes to the cutting room floor, just about all of it, and that says that they're choosing union over slavery, that they didn't want to upset the South. They didn't want to cause bad feelings amongst everybody because they needed everybody. And that choice of union over slavery does set us on a really bad path for decades when they have to keep choosing union over slavery. Was there a moment in which that could have changed? I think this is that moment. I think there is so much riding on that if those words stay, it might have put us on a different course.
All right, the next question, the related question. When you look back on Washington and Jefferson from 2 centuries later, you're like, couldn't you guys have just paid your guys? How hard would it have been to just pay your slaves and make them not slaves? Was there ever a chance that any of these founding fathers was going to do the right thing from our point of view?
Well, Washington does. I mean, Washington does. The enslaved people that he has control over. So Washington, a lot of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon are not under his control legally. They are Martha's, actually, because she's the one who inherits them through her deceased first husband. But Washington does at his death. Now, not before that, but at his death. And he says when Martha dies, they will be free, which does lead to one of the largest part of the free black community in Alexandria, Virginia. But Jefferson just loved wine and books and building his mansion, and that's part of the problem. Is Jefferson doesn't prioritize that over the comforts of his own life, and that does cause a problem. Now, Jefferson, in his 20s and 30s, is very anti-slavery. Jefferson's grievances begin and end with anti-slavery, but then after he goes to France and things, he starts to not talk about it very much anymore, and that does cause problems down the road.
What do you think the founding fathers would think about the current government and the way that the government is run now and everything? Because I mean, we're seeing a lot of people that would like to, even we got David Walker here on our network, that would like to have more of an independent voice, not necessarily Democratic and Republican. So, as one that has read this book, what do you think the founding fathers would think about the current state of our government and the way that we run our government?
Well, the founding fathers in 1776 are a little different than the founding fathers in 1787. But the founding fathers in 1776 would be absolutely appalled at the power of the executive branch. In 1776, they said the first 12 grievances of the Declaration are about executive power, monarchical power that's lodged in one man, having way too much power. And so when they created their first state constitutions in 1776, they entirely stripped any kind of executive of any power. They lodged all that control and authority in the legislature, in their representatives. So what today would be Article 1 of the Constitution, which is creating Congress. That Congress is what had control of everything at that point. Now, by 1787, they had found that was a little bit too extreme, that the pendulum was too far the other way. And so they kind of brought it back to give the presidency, Article 2 of the Constitution, a little bit more power, but nothing along the lines of how we're seeing it play out today.
And what are some of the other grievances that existed? We know the main grievances that you kind of alluded to, but there are other grievances that we don't even talk about and everything like that. And I think that your book talks about some of these grievances that we may not even be aware of. So as a fellow historian and everything like that, what are some of the grievances that even surprised you as you were doing your research, that you were going like, I didn't know that was a grievance?
Well, one of the things that's, it's interesting. There are kind of harmonies in the grievances that I didn't really think about. Sort of the deeper, if you think about this kind of as a musical score, kind of the deeper kind of themes that are in it. The Enlightenment, of which these guys, this is kind of the air in which these guys are breathing all the time. Franklin and Jefferson are very much involved in the American side of the Enlightenment. One of the watchwords, the key words for them is balance. That's how you don't have religious strife or civil strife, is you keep balance in things. And there's a lot of interesting balances in the grievances. The first one is about the king using the veto. So the king is refused his assent to laws to pass the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So he's explicitly vetoing things. But the second one is about suspension clauses. So in the American when American legislatures in Williamsburg and Annapolis and Boston pass laws, they don't go into effect until the king has approved them. But the king doesn't have to do anything at all. So the first one is about, those are basically like pocket vetoes, that these laws are suspended until the king gives approval, which is how all laws work in America, except Pennsylvania Avenue is not the Atlantic Ocean, and so they send these laws to London, and they have no idea if they're going to be they're viable or not. So this interesting kind of balance. So the king is doing too much in grievance 1 and not enough in grievance 2, and you see this in other places. There's kind of things about too much dependency on one single man in one part of it, and too much independence in another person. There's this kind of balance in the grievances that I thought was really kind of fun.
That makes a lot of sense and everything like that. Before I get to you, Rick, again, and I think you got another question. But one of our other founders, not Nick, but Kim, is a woman, and she's definitely a woman that's been involved in a lot of inventions and a lot of leadership roles and things along those lines. But what were the founding fathers' thoughts around women? Because we do call them the founding fathers. They're not the founding women and everything like that. So what was their role of women? You mentioned Martha Washington and others, and I'm sure that there were even some advisors. I mean, I think about Ronald Reagan back in the day, and a lot of people thinking that Nancy Reagan had his ear on a lot of issues, and I'm sure that the significant others of Jefferson, Washington, and others had their ear as well. But what was the role of women in leadership, and what was their thoughts, or were they able to contribute anything to this document?
Well, one of the women that kind of is a shadow presence throughout the whole book is Abigail Adams. John writes tells her everything. She gives him advice all the time. And in the first person that Jefferson gives a rough draft to or shows it to is John Adams. And John makes a secret copy. It could be secret. We don't know if Jefferson knew that he did this, but he sends one home to Abigail of what's going on here. And in it, it's included the long slave trade clause. John Adams writes it to him about 2 weeks before the 4th of July, we think. And then when Abigail sees the final draft, she's very disappointed. And she writes to John and says, there are some manly sentiments that I find wanting in the final draft. I assume they were expunged for for wise reasons, is what she says. And so she's hinting at that exchange of union for anti-slavery, but she's very disappointed. She wanted to see those words, the piratical warfare and assemblage of horrors, in the final document. So she is the first person that comes to my mind as far as a presence in the room who's not in the room.
Yeah.
So England managed to hold on to Canada. Canada didn't become fully independent, just looked it up, till 1982. Was there ever a soft landing possible for the U.S. and England, that they could have resolved their differences without war and revolution?
Well, the sticking point is, it is conventional wisdom in London that you cannot divide authority, that you can't have states within a state. That is England. The people in Parliament and the people surrounding the king say there has to be one buck that stops. That's all, right? And so if that's the case, then there's a real problem here. But as the war goes on, the English are already starting to rethink that. And in 1778, 2 years later, when the Americans are on the precipice of making an alliance with France, the English people start to move away from that and say, well, no. You guys, you can have a Continental Congress, you can have a Continental Army, we'll pardon everybody, just don't sign that alliance with France. And of course, we know that you can have states within a state because that's American federalism. And that's also the Commonwealth system that arises in the 19th century in England. So how Australia and New Zealand and Canada and everybody can have, and South Africa and all these colonies can be still in the British Empire but have their own power. The British compromised on that in 1775. I think there is a soft landing and there is no United States at that point. We become basically the first of this Commonwealth, but they just couldn't conceive of that yet.
Hey, just really quickly along those same lines and everything in that space, right now there's a lot of conversation around the way that we treat migrants from other places, whether that's from Mexico, whether that's from Canada, whether that's even from the African nations and everything like that. What were the people that were writing the Constitution thinking about our relationship with the other countries that are near us, whether that's like the South American countries, of course, the Central American countries, and Mexico, and of course, Canada to the north? So what were the folks that were writing the Constitution, were they thinking about our relationship with our immediate neighbors?
Well, sure. I mean, and when Richard Henry Lee on the 7th of June, so 250 years ago on Sunday, stood up to make the motion to take up the issue of independence, there's actually it's a 3-part motion, and part 1 is to write a Declaration of Independence. Part 2 is to create a union, which becomes the Articles of Confederation. And Part 3 is to draft what's called a model treaty. So it's about saying we are a separate nation, organizing that nation, and then and the model treaty is how are we going to engage with other countries because we are of the same level as France and Spain and Britain and Russia, et cetera. So there's a lot of international relations thinking, and those 3 things are happening at the same time. But the nations you're talking about here don't exist yet either. These are part of the Spanish Empire, but as far as Canada is concerned, we are currently invading Canada in the month before independence, and the failure of that invasion is also one of the things that is really a hot button issue in June of 1776 as that invasion has collapsed.
Yeah. Hey, Nick, I know you got royalty in your bloodline and everything like that, and maybe even Jacoby's got some questions as well. But what are your thoughts? Because definitely, I think you've got some Spanish I know you live in Spain, but I think there's also some Spanish monarchy in your bloodline and everything like that. So, what are your thoughts around this conversation?
Well, it's very interesting. Of course, the thing is how my ancestors got to the United States was through indentured servants. Basically, they lost the Battle of Dunbar because they were royals against Oliver Cromwell, who were the parliamentarians. In the Battle of Dunbar, unfortunately, the royals lost, and they needed to know what to do with them. So what they did is they shipped them to the American colonies back in 1650. And hence then, but Alexander Innes, if you go up his lineage, he was a direct descendant of Robert the Bruce, also Edward Plantagenet II. Also, they all intermarried. So the thing is also the King of Portugal, the first one that created the kingdom in Cambria, and also the King of France. Because what happens, it was funny, the royals all intermarried. So once you have a royalty tract, you have all the royals. The problem is America doesn't really give a rat's rear about royalty. They really don't. In other words, they hate royals, basically. They're as bad as the parliamentarians. Over in Europe, it's kind of a different thing. In Spain, it's actually where I live in Barcelona, where we're broadcasting from. They actually have a royal family here that sits on the throne of Spain. And also we still have one, as we know, in England. So it's just a little different in Europe when it comes to, they accept the royal lines. They don't have a lot of power. They have influence, but not a lot of power. But in the United States, you're considered like, well, you're horrible, you're aghast. But over there, what you do have is your new royalty. It's called the billionaires.
Right.
So go figure.
Right.
Okay. In other words, if you look at it in your country right now, you have a whole new set of royals. It's called the billionaires, and they're about to mint a half a dozen of them through Anthropic when it goes public. So you're going to have another group of royalty in the U.S. and they're considered basically sacrosanct over there. So you have a very lopsided economy where the rich 1% own half the assets and the other half own 1%. And now here in Bambton, we do business there with a company called Security Mutual. So I've been to Bambton before. But the thing is, I don't know what you guys are going to do about the lopsided economy that you have there, where 1% has 50% of all securities and the bottom 50% have 1%.
So
and that's not how they do
what
it.
Nick is saying. So if you spend any time on X, which you shouldn't, because it's a trash fire right now.
X is unbelievably trashy.
But what you see a lot of is this is the end of the American empire. America is done. From your historical perspective, how much trouble is the American project in?
Yeah, it's quite possible that America will slip into decline in the next decade, given the fact your national debt and your unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities exceed 125 trillion. So my prediction is by next decade, the U.S. will become a second or third rate country behind China and actually, in maybe cases, the European Union. So you'll be
around that, Rob, and everything like that, because I'd love to hear your thoughts around this as well, as Rick was saying, as a historian.
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is I know that Jefferson, Jefferson was only funny in a letter once. And that when he was talking about how all of the kings and queens of England are inbred, and they just get dumber and dumber and dumber as the generations go by, and by saying that he says, and of course we don't do that in America, so we're better. High fives all around, right? So that which is actually, it's a pretty funny letter when you read it, because he goes into all of the details about all these kings and queens and all over Europe. I have a friend who used to be a curator at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And he said to me a couple of years ago something that was very chilling, because he said I would walk around and I would listen to what people were talking about as they walked through the exhibits. And he said the thing that they talked about most of all is, I wonder where we are on the timeline. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, right? So where are we? How close are we to 1776? Are we closer to 1760, 65? When is this, the impression, when is this all going to reach a crisis and a head and fall apart? And the scary part about that is that the revolution was a bloody and horrible civil conflict that went on it was the longest war in American history until the Vietnam conflict. And it was devastating. And Uh, and it was only the first of the civil wars that we've had here. So I don't find a lot of optimism about what's in front of us. And I'm a little concerned about the flippantness about what that might look like.
And just along those same lines, because you mentioned earlier, and we have another show that we had earlier today, which is Dr. Patmos, and he does medicine and science and everything like that. And when I think of medicine and science, one of the founders of the Constitution was very much into medicine and science. But I was wondering your thoughts around Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin did a lot of stuff, whether it was with electricity or a number of other things that were going on in his life and everything like that. But definitely he was a part of the Enlightenment that you mentioned earlier and everything like that. But what was your take on him as one of the founders? Was he one of the good guys? Was he one of the bad guys? Because I've heard the whole things about whether he could seen as a good guy or a bad guy and everything like
Right.
that.
Well, in 1776, he's the old man in the room, right? He's by far the oldest. I mean, he's in his 70s at this point, and and this is a young room too. This is something else that's kind of surprising. I mean, Jefferson's 33, but there are people in that room who are in their early 20s. I mean, they make AOC look like an aged person here. It's a young group of people who are taking this on, and they look to Franklin. Franklin is the only person that has any kind of notoriety outside of the colonies. He's the only kind of famous American in the world at that point. But what the other part that's concerning, going back to the thing we just talked about, is there's a reverence for science and a reverence for learnedness. There's a reverence for becoming really learned about things in the 18th century, and that was something that was not seen as a problem or made you suspicious or made you kind of a suspicious elite. And there was an idea they hated an aristocracy that was you were born into, that you got without any kind of merit, but they had a lot of respect. Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington had a lot of respect for if you were smart and you worked really, really hard and you earned these things, then you should probably take a leadership role in this country, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, what was their take? Because one of the things we hear about, even in the push against DEI and everything like this, is this notion of meritocracy, and you kind of mentioned that and everything like that. So, what was their take on us being awarded for our skill sets and everything like that, which is basically what meritocracy is, and all along those lines? But what was their take on that? Is that the way that they wanted us to be going toward, or was it
Yes.
some kind of philosophy that they had in mind?
That's what makes America the best, the shining hope of the world. Is it is not based on who your father was or who your great grandfather was, or going back to tracing these lineages, right? And that is also something that's coming back too. I mean, talk about the creation of a new aristocracy, or with billionaires, right? That they're this idea that we're tracing our heritage back. That's not, the Americans we don't do that here. Right, and that's, if you think about the shock of lightning that Thomas Paine's Common Sense says. He says it's not just that King George is a tyrant, although he says that, but he says monarchs and aristocracy, their job is to give away places and make war on each other, and all they've done is lead the world to war, and we're not going to have that in America, because in America the law is king, which Paine capitalizes in Common Sense. But in America the law is king, and that's something that's the title of the last chapter in Tyrants and Rogues, because that is the thing that I think we need to remember at the front of mind, that what makes us different is the law. That in America, the law is king.
And you mentioned him, and I do remember studying him somewhere in college and everything along those lines. But I don't know that he has studied as much as some of the other people that we've mentioned and everything like that. So, what is your take on Thomas Paine and his role in the Declaration of Independence like that? Because he was definitely part of Common Sense, which you just mentioned, and everything like that. But I think that he is kind of fallen by the wayside in the way that he is treated and everything like that historically and everything like that. I don't hear as much about him as I hear about some of the other founders and everything like that.
Yes. And that happened in his lifetime. I mean, he was when he died, he was basically an unknown person. I think a couple of people come to his funeral, and he's buried in upstate New York in what was at that point kind of just he was entirely ignored. And the reason for that in his lifetime was that he had written a book that was very, very scandalous, which was an atheistic tract, and so he had fallen out of favor with religious folk of the time, which was so prevalent that had made him kind of a persona non grata. Paine is extraordinarily important in the 1770s. He arrives in Philadelphia right after the First Continental Congress has sat, and he's an Englishman who just comes to America, but he comes at a moment of extraordinary excitement and crisis. And he absorbs all that, and he can translate it because he comes from England. He's a very, very disgruntled person coming from England. He's been sacked by the British government in an unfair way, and he sees the kind of inequalities that happen in Great Britain towards poor people, and how taxes fall differently on things, and how privileges fall differently on things. And so he is a radical of the moment, and he does. And so what Common Sense does when it comes out in January of 1776 is it captures, it sort of fuses all these things that were kind of in the air, and it really sort of gives meaning to what was already mostly on a lot of American people's minds. That's why it becomes such a phenomenon.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We got Sasha joining us. Sasha is in Canada. We were talking about Canada earlier in his role with the Declaration of Independence, but he is also originally from Ukraine. And of course, he does a show every Tuesday and Friday about Ukraine and their brave resistance against Russia and everything like that. But I was just wondering, from your standpoint, how much has the Declaration of Independence influenced other countries as they have been fighting for freedom? Because I know that a lot of times they are using it as a framework and everything like that. We mentioned South Africa earlier, and I think Nelson Mandela might have even used the Declaration of Independence and others as well. But I just wanted your take on how much the Declaration of Independence has been used as more and more changes are going on around the world.
Well, that's so this is one of the sort of the disconnects, right? When in 1776, I think the grievances matter a great deal, but in the generations afterwards, the words that speak to people are the ones that we know at the top of the document, because they are universal, and it is our mission statement. It's a way to really give meaning to when we talk about an American creed or an American dream. These are the things that we aspire to, and it also kind of highlights the gap between what we think we are, what we want to be, and who we actually are. So it allows for critics of that, like abolitionists or African Americans or women's rights people, advocates, to say, look at this gap between, and so they often rewrite it. But then that goes all over the world in the 19th and 20th century. I mean, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam very famously kept a copy of the Declaration on him. Nelson Mandela, that's become something that is, because it's not it's all men, it can work all over the world, and it has.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
It's not applicable at all to Ukraine and its fight against Russia. It's not a fight for freedom. It's a fight against aggression, against your country, against your people. Nothing about freedom here at all. Forget about that word freedom. It's a cliche which is used every minute and a half. It's nothing. They defend to your country against aggression. That's what is meaning. So when Ukrainians are shooting down thousands of Russian men, that's an act of defense against aggression. It's not fight for freedom. When you kill 1,000 Russians a day, it's not for freedom. It's to defend your country. And it's a long time ago, Ukrainians understand that they're taking over back their territories that Russia occupied. That's not the goal in itself, because once you kill more and more Russians, your territory will come back to you anyway. So forget about territories. They will be yours anytime. And now, when Ukraine developed superior drones technologies, they're number one in the world by far. This year, Ukraine will produce 7 million drones, whereas United States will produce 300 drones. And because United States refused to accept Ukrainian technologies, drone technologies about defense and about attacking capabilities, they now lost Apache helicopter. Oh my God, what a cruel thing Iranians did to United States. They downed the helicopter. It's great that the two pilots survived. It's really great thing because it would be a great insult to injury if they would not. So this is good. So I'd like to ask for forgiveness about to disillusion many of you about that freedom and freedom and freedom and more freedom. Forget about freedom. You have to defend your country. That's what number one is. That's what the government exists for, to defend your country, your people, your territory. Freedom, it's number two, number three, maybe number five on the list.
That's your
Well,
opinion.
and that's the case in 1776 too. I mean, the reason that they don't send a copy of the Declaration of Independence to King George is because they feel like this he doesn't have to be made aware that this is breakup is happening because he is the aggressor. That we are just defending ourselves from him sending over fleets of armies or fleets of ships and hired assassins to kill us. And so this is a defensive thing. But the idea of how you rouse the population to defend is to tell them that what we are fighting for is our own self-determination. And I think that does have some resonances with what the Ukrainians are fighting for as well.
Wait a sec. How King of England could be aggressor of a territory that belonged to England? How is it possible? He was definitely not an aggressor. It was Americans who didn't want to pay taxes. That's all there is to 1976. The people didn't want to pay taxes. They don't want to pay taxes today, but the IRS is a mighty apparatus that makes them pay. Not all of them. A lot of people still don't pay their share of taxes. They have all these wonderful tax lawyers and accountants and so on. So, because if all people in the United States would pay their share of taxes, and that's what actually the lately Johnson from NVIDIA, he made an offer to all his friends, billionaires. Please pay your taxes. Stop doing all this maneuvers with great your tax accountants and tax lawyers and so on. Just pay your fair shares. You're billionaires, multi-billionaires. So what are you doing to your country?
Hold on
Nobody.
just 1 second, Rick, because we have Steve here now. We go a little bit over and everything like that. Not much over, but a little bit over and everything like that. Steve, we've got Robert Parkinson, who's written a book about tyrants and rogues and the independence and the Declaration of Independence. So I don't know who one of your favorite people that wrote the Independence was and everything like that, because you and your family came over from, I think you're second generation, if I remember correctly, from India and everything like that. He's a second or third generation. But who are some of your favorite people that were in the Declaration of Independence? And maybe you've got a question for Mr. Parkinson.
Well, I mean, I just saw the musical Hamilton again for the fourth time, and it was really great to kind of hear the American story again. Obviously, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. I have a lot of admiration for Ben Franklin. We don't hear a lot about him in the musical. I think all the founding fathers, Madison, they all, John Adams. I mean, all of them, I think, had a say in the Declaration of Independence. And I think what America's secret sauce has always been is, what they call a liberal democracy, one where the state's not too strong and is kind of a check and balance, and there's individual liberties and freedoms. But I think a lot of times freedom and democracy, picking up on what Sasha said, that you're defending against aggression, you have these illiberal democracies. In Hungary, where Viktor Orban ran, and he said it was a democracy, but you have the state coming in, controlling things. I think even India, the world's largest democracy where my parents grew up, today under Modi, I think is no longer a liberal democracy. I think it's a liberal democracy where you have strong state, you have suppression of journalism, you have, religious minorities that are now being targeted. Uh, and I think that, and it's hard for me to say that as someone who's proud of the progress that India has made, where my parents have come from. It's now the third largest economy. So I think freedom can be used very generally, and I think that's what's always made America great. I think we're getting a little bit away from that now with Trump, as we put pictures on buildings and talk about putting your names on things. You wonder if the state will become too strong and will strike that balance. And my question is to the guest. What he thinks of Jeff Daniels' tirade in the newsroom, where he goes off and he goes, we're not the only country with liberty and freedom. Japan has freedom. Canada has freedom. Belgium has freedom. 270 sovereign states in the world have freedom. And so there's this notion of, everyone just says only America has freedom, and that's not necessarily true. So I guess that's just we'd love to hear your insight, but that's where I stand on the Declaration of Independence, my favorite founders. But I think America has endured as we celebrate America 250. Lots of things we can work on, lots of things terrible injustices that happen, but I think the country has survived because of that balance between individual freedoms and liberties and somewhat of a centralized state, federal government, and independent states.
Yeah, what's your take on that, Mr. Parkinson, and everything like that? Because what he said about the fact that there are multiple countries, and I'd also love to hear your thoughts as we're winding down about two men that he mentioned, because I also went sometime back and saw the play Hamilton, so we haven't really talked about Hamilton and Madison, so I'd love to hear your thoughts around them as well.
Sure. I mean, I think that I've seen that speech on the newsroom before, and it is, and again, it is about the kind of the gap between what is the imagined American place in the world and what is the reality, and that imagined thing can get. I mean, that's when we talk about making America great again. What does that mean? Where does the greatness, and how real was that ever the case, and how special is it to the United States? I think those are questions to ask. When we talked about Hamilton and Madison, Hamilton, of course, is a very young man in 1776. He's I think in his early 20s, and is very, very interested in these things, and gets involved and joins on Washington's staff during the Battle of Long Island that's coming in the fall of 1776. Madison is even younger than that, and he's not going to be involved. But both of them see, again, as I go back to this idea about expertise and really, I mean, Madison today would not be a politician. He'd be a professor of political science, a very, very good professor of political science. And so taking those examples and reading deeply and really mulling over what is the place of government in society, and how do we protect the fragility of Republican government and self-government, those are the things that they were very, very interested in. And we don't. Those are, by the way, acts of creation, not destruction. The Declaration is a destruction, but the articles and the Constitution are acts of creation, and those are really, really hard to pull off.
All right, two things. One is plug your book and websites, whatever else you have. Two is the Constitution was built to be modifiable. Can it be successfully modified to fix some of our stuff in the current landscape?
It can. It's just going to take tremendous amounts of work. I mean, I think when I talk about my students so George Washington says exactly one thing at the Constitutional Convention. He's in the president's chair, and he doesn't say anything until the very end when he says, hey, guys, we set the floor for congressional districts at 40,000 people. Not the ceiling, the floor. And he says, I think that's too high. Let's lower it to 30,000. And everybody says, whatever you say, General, you're whatever. So what does that tell us? That tells us Washington believed that congressional districts should be closer to the people than they had originally set them. Well, look at the size of congressional districts today. I mean, the average is 800,000, and sometimes much, much more than that. Because we've decided to set the terms of the room of the House of Representatives to a certain size. They say, hey, we can't put any more desks in here. But that's all there in the Constitution and very modifiable. Today, I get my students to get their calculators out, and I said, okay, divide 350 million by 30,000. How many reps should we have? And they're like, oh my God, we should have like 12,000 reps. I'm like, yeah, that every 3 city blocks in New York City should have their own representative in Congress. Those ideas are there. We just need to spend some time thinking like they did about should we make radical changes to these things, and should we take charge of our own lives? That's the key thing. The past, the earth belongs to the living, is what Jefferson said. We should take control of our lives and not be beholden to the past. The book is called Tyrants and Rogues: Understanding the Declaration of Independence. I'm on Blue Sky if you want to look me up there, and you can also find me at on my faculty page at binghamton.edu.
I appreciate that. And get ready to wind up and everything like that. Just really quickly, the final question and everything like that. And kind of Rick alluded to it, but we've had attempts to amend the Constitution and everything like that. I think about the ERA amendment. There have been things around gun control and everything else that people have wanted and everything like that. But as a historian and as you have studied the Declaration of Independence, how easy would it be to do and everything like that? Because of course we've had some things that have been very successful, even though some of them have been are being in the process of being possibly retracted, like the Voting Rights Act and things along those lines. But how easy would it be to actually amend the Constitution and the things that were created with the Declaration of Independence in your mind?
Not easy at all, and that's part of the point. I mean, when I talk with my students about how hard it is to get across the line on the 4th of July, 1776, the reason that it's hard and you have to get all these tiny little maneuvers to get everybody to yes is because you are empowering the people themselves to make these decisions. If King George wants to declare independence, he just says, we're doing it, right? And so it's over as soon as he says it. That's how a sovereign works. But that's not how we work, and so it's very, very difficult to get those across the line. And so but it's worth the investment to do that. Just like we have to big fight with carbon, we have a big fight to modify the structure of the government.
Appreciate you and everything like that. We've got other shows that'll be coming up, including Sasha's investment show coming up at 1:00 and everything along those lines. But I appreciate you being a guest, and hopefully we can have you come back in the near future and everything like that. But I've definitely learned a lot in this conversation, and I appreciate you being a guest on the show today as we talked about the Declaration of Independence and the celebration of 250. So I definitely appreciate you being on.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, guys.
No problem.